This I command you, love one another. If you are anything like me, then you might be tempted at times to think, well, that's all fine and good, but real life is really quite complicated and quite different from all of that. Sometimes I'm tempted to think, Jesus cannot really expect me to do this, to do the impossible. On reflection, of course, I realize that this reaction is absurd. For it amounts to saying that the Son of the living God, through whom we confess all things were made, is somehow naive. That this command about loving one another is just some form of guileless pablum. Yet you and I know that that is the world talking. And as he does in this gospel, God has something very different to say, something very different indeed. And yet, who could blame us for doubting whether such a love is possible in this world? Darfur, Iraq, Congo, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Stoneham Douglas High School. The violence of the 20th century alone, a mere 20 years concluded, claimed the lives of almost 300 million people, the size of the present-day population of the United States and El Salvador. Tonight we gather to commemorate that day, 30 years ago, when 6 Jesuits and 2 of their household family at the university in San Salvador were brutally martyred in the early morning hours. Who could blame us for doubting? My predecessor as editor-in-chief of America Magazine, Father Joseph O'Hare, gave the homily at the Memorial Mass here in New York, just 1 week after that terrible event 30 years ago. We gather to mourn, he said. Yet we mourn not only for them, but for all the victims of a wasteful war that has bled a tiny and tortured country. He continued, we mourn for the 70,000 people of El Salvador who have died in this war, and the hundreds of thousands who have been displaced. We remember the martyrs that preceded these victims. Rutilio Grande, a Jesuit assassinated in 1977. The same year that a right-wing paramilitary group ordered every Jesuit to leave the country or face execution. We remember Archbishop Oscar Romero, Father O'Hare said, struck down by an assassin's bullet while celebrating Mass. We remember also the 4 American women missionaries who were kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered by military forces in December of 1980. Our commemoration today, he concluded, is marked by a deep sense of sorrow at the loss of human life and the cruelty of years of fruitless fighting. Who could blame us for doubting? in our own time, for such fighting continues. But the martyrs Father O'Hare cited, men and women whose lives were claimed in that fruitless fighting, they have not borne a fruitless witness, for their sacrifices have borne a harvest of the fruits of faith and hope and love, a harvest which transcends time and space, that feeds us even now. For they are witnesses to the love of which the Lord speaks in this gospel. And their testimony still lives in the memory of those they served there, of the men and women they still inspire here and everywhere. This love of which the Lord speaks, the love for which they died, is not mere sentiment. It is the hard work of a living faith. Love isn't a state of perfect caring, the Reverend Fred Rogers once said. It is an active noun, like struggle. And in our time, their time, for Jesuits and our companions throughout the world, the struggle of love, the struggle to love one another, has taken a specific and a costly direction. In his homily 30 years ago, Father O'Hare recalled the 33rd General Congregation of the Jesuits at Rome in the fall of 1983, when Father Ignacio Ellacuría spoke with passion of the agony of his people and the need to respond now to the institutionalized violence of massive poverty and repression that were crushing his people. Father Ellacuría's words then echoed the common commitment of Jesuits and our companions everywhere to serve faith and promote justice, to see in this twofold mandate the earthly program of the Lord's divine command. What is it to be a companion of Jesus today? The Jesuit fathers asked at an earlier general congregation. It is to engage under the standard of the cross, they said, in the crucial struggle of our time, the struggle for faith, and that struggle for justice which it includes. Thus, the way to faith, they wrote, and the way to justice are inseparable. And it is up this undivided road, this steep road, they reminded us, that the pilgrim church must travel and toil ever onward in complete obedience to the Lord's command, love one another. And it is on this steep road, throughout the march of years, that some among us have paid the greatest price according to the world's standard, and yet gained the greatest prize according to the standard of the gospel. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Thus, in its always curious and paradoxical and subversive way, the gospel shows us the way out of humanity's homicidal mania. Loving one another, our neighbors, our enemies. It isn't just a nice idea. It is necessary. It is the only means of our escape. For only something as radical as the love of which the Lord speaks and to which these martyrs testify has the power to save us from ourselves. It does seem impossible, though, this radical, life-changing love, the radical work of a faith that does justice. Yet it only seems impossible. It must be possible. For God does not ask us to do what is impossible. That would be cruel. And there is already a surplus of cruelty. Yet God also knows that we cannot fulfill this command without His grace, without the companionship of our fellow pilgrims, especially those who have shown us the way through their greater love. As He did for the martyrs of our time, of every time, God calls every one of us out of darkness and into His light. In the light of His grace, we cannot see what might have been, but we do see what was, and the power and the spirit of what was is enough to dream anew of what might yet be. This dream, it is not an idealist's fantasy. It is the grace of God realized here, within us, at this altar. For this liturgy is not merely a remembrance of things past. It is the touchstone of our present and a rite of dedication to our future. For we gather to remember our martyred brothers and sisters, not with mere words and earthly gestures, but through the sacrament of love beyond all measure. And it is here, in the Eucharist, in the Paschal mystery of God, that we find that place where the seemingly impossible becomes possible, where what is hidden in darkness is brought to light, where senseless sorrow is charged with meaning, where human weakness is redeemed and hope reborn. The souls of the faithful departed still live. They still live in us. Above all, they still live because the one they encountered in this Eucharist, the one they died to serve, the one who was crucified and yet rose triumphant, He still lives. And thus faith and hope and love will never die.